Now we have all our holes, centers located. We know exactly where all the center of these holes is. Now we need the individual holes. So if I take a look at the part that I'm trying to make, these holes have lots of different properties to them. Some you can see kind of have this chamfer, some are holes and then inside a hole, some go all the way through, some don't go all the way through. There's all kinds of different properties. And let's take a peek at that for a second. And take a look at what these holes are doing. So if I'm taking a look at these holes, this one here is just a straight simple hole that goes all the way through. This one here is called a blind hole because it doesn't go all the way through. It only goes part way through the material. This one here is a through hole, but it's got, this is called a counter bore. This one here is a through hole, but it's got a counter sink. Counter sink, counter bore, counter sink, counter bore. Through hole, through hole, through hole, blind hole. This one here is a blind hole, and it's got a counter sink. This one here is a tiny, tiny, tiny blind hole with a counter bore. So counter bores, counter sinks, through and blind holes. That's the two big things that we do. And those are done differently because we have different fasteners that have to go in those holes. So if we have this type of flat head and we want it to be nice and smooth, we use a counter sink. Oval head just kind of rounds up a little bit, but we have a counter sink. This pan head screw needs a counter bore. So you can kind of see what the bottom of the head looks like according to what they need, counter bores or counter sinks. So these first two are counter sinks, but everything else is a counter bore that we need. If we want to sink that head down so that head sits here and it's flush on top or it's smooth on top and we can't catch anything. If I would put one of those bolts in right here, the head of the bolt would stick up above. Sometimes that's needed, sometimes it's not. So we can kind of see what's happening here. Those counter sunk heads, these are sitting right up on top. This is called a spot face. Here's a counter bore where the head goes all the way down. The other thing we have to understand with holes when we're bolting things together is we can bolt it where the bolt goes all the way through and we put a nut on the bottom. We can bolt it here and it goes through and then it gets threaded into the material, the lower material. So we can put threads in metal or wood or material and then the bolt can screw into it and it holds tight. This one here is just a stud, it's called, that's screwed in and then we put a nut on top. So that's just our situations there. And that's how we work with this stuff. All right, so now comes to reading the directions here. So this here, we're going to start down here with a blind hole. Diameter is 300 to a depth of 1 inch. Blind hole. So I'm going to choose my hole command. I'm going to go simple. Told me to go simple. Said to go blind. Custom. Diameter. Right here, it's a diameter. 300 to a depth of 1 inch. And I'm going to click here. And hit check. Something went wrong. Oh, 300 inches. 0.300. That's why. We had a hole that drilled the whole thing out. So there is my first hole that I put on. Now I still need to see this sketch, so I'm going to hover over this sketch and just hit the show sketch. My next one here is a through hole, simple hole 500. So I'm going to hit that. Create a hole. 0.5. And instead of blind, I'm going to go through and hit check. So now that hole's created. My next hole. This is a counter bore. So it's a 250 through. So this hole is 250.25. This counter bore is 0.5 to a depth. This little arrow down is to a depth of 0.25. And it says counter bore here. I put that on there so you can see what that is. So I'm going to do a hole. Simple counter bore. I want it to go through because I want the hole through to go through. Then it says how wide do I want that? So I want the first part to be 0.25. So that's the size of the hole that's going all the way through. And then the counter bore is 0.5 to a depth. I'm going to pull it up quick. To a depth of 0.25. And it says sketch points to place holes. Click on that sketch point. There's my counter bore. And there's my hole. Next up, this one here is going to be, it's a through hole, counter sink, because it's got that V looking, so it looks like a counter sink. It doesn't look like the U there. Counter sink for a 1/4-20, this is 1/4 inch by 20 threads per inch, threaded hole. So countersink ANSI threaded. So I'm going to come over here, make a hole, through hole, but I want to go countersink through. I'm going to go to ANSI, tapped, tap means threaded, 1/4-20, click on it, and I got that done. And I know this is a lot. It'll take a few times to get used to it. That's why we're doing a whole bunch of these. Here is a countersunk hole with a diameter of 250 to a depth of 500. So I'm going to come over here, make a hole, countersunk. We're not through anymore, we're blind. Custom, or I can go ANSI. Just drilled hole. 0.25, which is 1/4. So if I'm looking over here, 0.036, 0.1, 2, 3, 4, 1/4 inch. Pick on that hole. Oh, and then a depth of 0.5. Check mark that. So then the countersink with 0.5. Countersink width. Check that off. Next one here. This is an ANSI drill 1/32 again. And I'm going to look here. I'm going to go 0.031 to a depth of 0.5. Counter bore 0.438 to a depth of 0.25. So I'm going to come slide over here, drill a hole, counter bore, blind, ANSI, drilled 1/32. .031, 2. Counter bore 4.38 to a depth of 0.25. Let's see if that was right. Yep. Yep. And check that off. Oh, forgot to pick the sketch point. And that's the process. Of making these holes come into play here. I'm going to have to close that out, delete that one, and redo it. And just redo that one. But that's the process of making holes. And that's how you read what this is saying to do. So you can go ahead, go back up to the top of all this, and you can go through and make all the rest of your holes here. Again, if you see these holes here, if they have dots around them, this means they're threaded. If they don't have dots, that means they're not threaded. So there's a threaded hole, there's a threaded hole, threaded hole, threaded hole, or tapped, they're called. So they got threads in them, but we tap threads. So we use a tap to make threads. And that's how we create all those different parts and pieces and different holes. So get used to making these holes this way. It'll save you tons of time coming up.